they're interested in like safe, measured growth under bureaucratic kind of conditions. And so we're seeing the reign of foxes right now because they're the ones whose personality sets are kind of optimized to get the incentives that are currently handed out by the system.
This is not a business where you take polls. It's a business where you think. You're not right or wrong because 1,000 people agree with you.
Auron, great to have you on the podcast, man. Thanks for coming on.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're one of the guests that we've wanted to have for a long time. We're both a fan of your Twitter accounts and the work that you do there in your Substack, and now the Blaze, which is exciting. So wanted to frame this conversation. You do a lot of work on kind of culture and politics. You're a political commentator online at the Blaze. Do a lot of writing on what's going on around us in your Substack. And we at New Foundling, we talk with a lot of people who are eager to build. They kind of see a little bit of what's going on around us. They understand what time it is. They understand the need to build good, long-lasting, faithful institutions, whether these are businesses or schools or companies or even just families. So they get that the only way out is through building. But a lot of folks don't realize that the rules of the game, as it were, have changed from what their fathers and their fathers had. They were also building things, but the fundamental landscape of reality upon which we're building these things. And building is good, but the fundamental texture or structure of reality upon which we're building these things has changed. And you call this, you're sort of the expert, you've coined this term of the total state as the way in which reality is now structured and upon which we need to build. The rules of the game have changed. The deck is stacked in a particular direction. We want to get into all of that so that you can help the audience who's going to be listening to this understand what the rules are, how the deck is stacked so they can build. But before we get into the total state and a lot of the work and thinking you've done there, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, how you transitioned from an anon account to being at the Blaze and now being public about your work and your writing?
Yeah, sure. No, I was always very interested in politics from when I was young, listening to conservative talk radio, and ended up getting a degree in political science. I worked briefly in Republican politics, kind of down in Florida, and then taught some high school. I eventually ended up becoming a journalist focusing in crime and politics. And I kind of learned as I was behind the scenes with journalism that things didn't really work the way that I understood. I started seeing how stories got shaped. I was in press gaggles watching, reporters kind of shape events in real time. It felt like in many ways, the way the press reported things was just as important as what actually happened in kind of the government, that had as much, if not more power. And I started to kind of understand many of the ways in which narrative drives our system. And then around 2020, I saw obviously the lockdowns and the riots, and it was very clear, like, the Constitution just didn't work. Like, all this stuff I'd been told about, the Bill of Rights and how it was going to protect our religious liberties, and this is what the Second Amendment is for, and then like, just not, even my libertarian friends were like, yeah, you just got to do what the government tells you to do. And I was like, okay, so we never meant any of this, I guess. And so I was like, okay, well, then how does politics actually work? Like, if the Constitution isn't in charge, if the Bill of Rights doesn't actually restrict government, if the branches of government aren't really balanced and don't really control everything, then how does power really work? And that's when I started reading a lot of the guys that I used to kind of explain power, Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land, and older thinkers in the Italian elite school like Vilfredo Pareto and Gaetano Mosca, James Burnham. And I started kind of making videos about this. I started tweeting about this. I did so anonymously at that point because I was teaching at the time, and obviously, like, you can easily lose your job for having any kind of political opinion, especially if it's right wing. Well, only really if it's right wing. And so right. I was doing that, under just like a PFP. And then eventually kind of got the opportunity to go on things like Tim Pool, account kind of blew up. Didn't understand, how fast that was going to go. But all of a sudden I was showing up on bigger things and kind of was showing my face. And eventually I got an offer to kind of do the same thing professionally on the Blaze. And so that's where I've been at for the last 7 months or so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Going back to the journalism days, was there any particular story or experience you had where you kind of saw behind the curtain in terms of, where it shifted your perspective on how stories are created and how, I'm curious to hear, I've never been in the news industry, but like how it's talked about from the inside for the reporters as they're building the stories?
Sure. I don't know if you remember this, but, kind of prefiguring a lot of what would come in our Cultural Revolution, there was that showdown over Confederate statues, right? All of a sudden, as if by some magic decree, people all over the country just felt the need to rip down Confederate statues. They did it in violation of the law. They did so violently, and none of the police did anything. Even the Republican politicians, for the most part, just kind of stood by or openly supported it, said, oh, maybe these things should be in a museum, blah, blah, blah. They had all these excuses for why they should retreat in the face of things. And the Florida governor, who I regularly covered at the time because he would just show up and we'd do press gaggles, so I was at many of his events, made a statement basically saying, like, I don't really support some of these people. The Charlottesville thing had happened. And he said, I don't really support this stuff. I don't like these people. But that doesn't mean you get to like violently tear down statues and stuff. Like that doesn't mean that you get to be a mob. And the reporter at the time, another reporter, while I was in the press gaggle, just completely took his words and twisted them, like completely altered what he said and put it as if he had supported the Charlottesville, kind of protests. And that was the story. That was what everybody said. That's what everybody reported. I knew different. I had the recording. I was there live. And plenty of people came out and said, this didn't happen. Like, this is wrong. We can prove it. But it didn't matter because someone had already said the opposite. That's what all the story had run. And so that was now the truth, even though, it was actively twisted on purpose by a reporter with an agenda and could easily be proven wrong. Nobody cared. They had the story they wanted. And so that became the story. And so that was probably like, there are many things like this, but that was probably the starkest contrast for me.
Was that a left-leaning newspaper or?
Oh, they're all left-leaning newspapers.
I know,
yeah.
But was it explicitly so at the time, or was it?
No, I mean, they wouldn't have said it out loud, but yeah, it was a Gannett property. It was everybody there was from a liberal journalist school. They were all there. They all knew what their job was, and it's not accurately reporting the facts. And by the way, that reporter ended up getting rewarded for doing that. Like they ended up getting picked up by Politico, I believe. Like, so, so not only did they do this, they immediately got rewarded just, I think, a few months later for being an activist and a propagandist instead of a journalist. So not only does this happen, everybody knows this is actually what you're supposed to do, and you'll be rewarded if you do it.
Yeah, that's interesting and terrifying. What year was this story that you're describing? Is it like 2012, 2010?
I guess it would have been whatever Charlottesville was. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head now. It would have had to be like 2018 probably. Would be my I don't have it right in front of me, but
yeah, 2018. But now we've seen increasingly so, and certainly during Twitter. This is when I reactivated my Twitter account. Was it during 2020 during COVID? Because it seemed like the only place. I took a 10-year hiatus from Twitter basically, and then during COVID I reactivated my Twitter as a way just to be able to get a sliver of truth before accounts were banned. A sliver of truth of what was going on and how to think through these things so that I could inform my family. So increasingly, we're seeing the move to a decentralized narrative platform, especially now that Elon owns it. So how's been that shift for you, going from the machine of centralized narrative construction, in journalism, now moving towards being one of the, being on the forefront of the decentralized narrative platforms?
It's been good. It's very interesting because Twitter, like you said, it's fractured. And so it's weird because you don't know. Sometimes it can be difficult to judge the scope of a story because you don't really have that filtering mechanism. But at the same way it's good because you don't have that filtering mechanism, and the filtering mechanism was lying to you. And so there's this odd trade-off in where you usually get more accurate information, you get less filtered information, but you have to start exercising your own discretion when it comes to the intensity of importance. You have to, okay, everyone on my timeline is suddenly commenting on this. All of a sudden, this story seems like everywhere to me. But in the real world, most people have no clue what this story is, right? And that can be because the mainstream media has decided that they don't care, right? So that's why they don't know. But sometimes it's simply because Twitter has just blown it out of proportion. And so you have to keep one foot in the real world. You have to touch grass, from time to time, so that you can kind of judge, like, okay, is the thing that am I not hearing about this from my friends because the mainstream media has actively colluded to suppress a story or a narrative that is not good for them? Or am I not hearing this from my friends because really this doesn't touch most people, and Twitter has just rewarded people who are currently dunking on this or generating heat with this? And so it's really good that there's this decentralized option. You really cannot replace Twitter as a source for news. It is the most unfiltered news source around. It's really indispensable in that way. There are other places like Gab that do this, but they just don't have the diversity of kind of opinion on the site to allow for a wider amount of information to flow through it. So there are other places, to be fair, that are doing kind of the free speech thing, and you can get unfiltered, uncensored news. But again, just because some of those tend to be kind of ghettoed by the people who are communicating there, Twitter still kind of dominates when it comes to kind of the free flow of information. But you do have to kind of like check in with the real world and be like, okay, is this really a big story, or is this just a big story because it gets people clicks?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think something like Gab is all social media that's analogous to Twitter, somewhere like Twitter, Gab, and I guess now Threads is its own beast. But like Gab is a group chat, essentially a public group chat. But the problem with it is that it's only the same, for the most part, the people that think the same are in that group chat. On Twitter, the nice thing about it, also chaotic, but the nice thing about it is that it's a massive group chat where you have guys like you, guys like us, people who are our friends, but also AOC, Elon Musk, all involved in the same. So you get to interact with them, whereas in Gab they're just not there.
Twitter's power is in that it's the Coliseum. People don't understand Twitter. They think Twitter's a place to like debate ideas and share. It's like, no. Twitter is a place for live combat. People show up to see someone bleed. So like that doesn't work on Gab because, like you said, most people kind of agree. Like you have some disagreement, but it's not along any single lines. Twitter, like, AOC can say something stupid and can get ratioed into the ground. And that's kind of the magic of Twitter, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether you think that embraces the worst parts of humanity or not, it is the truth. People show up to Twitter because it's the Coliseum. That's why I don't think you're going to see Threads blowing up anytime soon.
Yeah. And we now literally have Elon Musk posting photos of himself with MMA fighters and Zuckerberg.
We're literally getting
It's like becoming an actual reality.
They will fight at the Coliseum, at least the Italian government said.
I don't know.
Yeah, you're okay to do
that. Though you do think, Commodus wanted to be a gladiator. You're not supposed to have your rulers want to be the gladiators. The gladiators were slaves. So it's probably not a good sign when the ruling elite want to do it, but whatever.
Yeah, senior engineers just go out to duke it out on behalf of their overlords.
So when you are touching grass, so to speak, or saying, okay, here's the online world, I realize it's not real per se. I need to be like have boots on the ground or actually be in touch with reality. How are you doing that? Because it does seem so difficult. Really, anything online is not quote unquote the real world. Because of how spun everything has become. But for you, how are you getting those touch points?
I am pretty lucky in a number of ways. I've got a very loving family who is not online at all and could not care less. Like they're mildly impressed that I ended up working for a guy they know called Glenn Beck, but otherwise they don't really care. It's not a big deal. And so they're very real. They're very grounded. They're very normal. Church, same way. I've also got a really good friend group of guys who I've been friends with for well over a decade. and we get together at least once every week or other week, and have like a board game night and stuff. And again, like they just couldn't care less. I might as well tell them about my day changing oil. It just doesn't matter to them. And so like when we sit down, we're just not talking about any of this stuff, and then that's good, because that's not what I want my friend group to be. So
yeah, that makes sense. Now, what would you? So I want to dig into like how to use Twitter, because I've heard you talk about before. If I remember correctly, you were encouraged to be on Twitter because you originally were just on YouTube, and somebody told you need to be on Twitter to be able to use this as a distribution channel. So now that you've not just learned the ropes, but master the ropes of Twitter in some ways, like how do you, someone listening to this and they're not very online the way Josh is just describing, and they want to be on Twitter, especially because they understand it's the best news source there is. How would you say this is how you need to structure your Twitter use? This is the best way to use Twitter.
Yeah, it's weird because, like you said, I never expected to be good at Twitter. I never expected that to be a thing that mattered. I started on YouTube, and someone's like, "Oh, if you want people to watch your stuff, you gotta share it out." I'm like, I'm not gonna put it on Facebook or something. And they're like, "Well, why don't you use Twitter?" And so I went on Twitter, and I just started putting out my videos, and then I started commenting on stuff, and kind of slowly but surely, that kind of rose up. And so it's weird because like I didn't go in with a plan, so I can't give you like a 10-point like here's how to launch a successful Twitter account, because in many ways I just kind of lucked into it. But I A/B tested enough stuff where eventually I kind of discovered what worked and what didn't. And so like I have a good idea how it works now, but kind of I built it in a way that probably would have been unconventional. Probably I don't know if you can just copy paste it, but the main thing I learned was that Twitter is, we think of Twitter as a reading medium, but it's not. It's a visual medium. It's driven by kind of the way people see things and what they click on and what they stop in their feed to scroll on and retweet and those kind of things. And I think anybody who really thinks about this realizes that, because like you can make a personal account with a lot of really deep stuff and like really grind hard to get to 10,000 followers. But if you're like a meme account of any regular posting, you will just blow up to 100,000 followers. Like it's the first 50,000 are basically free. Like, because it's so there's definitely a thing where like having easily communicatable and shareable things is really critical on Twitter. A lot of people want to like break in and write the like deepest think piece thread and like blow up that way, but that's not really how it works. Like there are some people who can just do that infinitely, like 0 HP Lovecraft just does that effortlessly, and obviously like he's well respected for that. But for most people, that's not really how it's going to start. So I would say like early on, I found all of my success by making memes. I just made memes. And obviously if you're a meme account, you can share like just general memes. Credit people's memes, by the way, guys. But making memes is obviously the best, because then like you're the originator, and people will kind of notice that it's your work. And so I found that making memes was a great way to kind of get people in the door. And then like reactions to stories, like just having quick, insightful reactions, things that are no more than like a slogan or a line or two. A lot of people think that Twitter is again about being like the most original, like it's this, I gotta be the smartest kid in the room all the time. And actually it's about repetition. Like building a brand is about like saying the same thing kind of over and over again, because you can't just assume that everyone who follows you sees every tweet you make. In fact, they see almost no tweets that you make, the people who follow you. And so you really need to treat it as if most people have never seen what you've said before when you're saying it. You can't just assume that people have read everything that you put out. So repetition is really important. And then you can get more specialized. Like once you start building up through repetition and easily digestible stuff, then I started doing things like writing threads that were in depth and stuff, and they would get a ton of get 1,000 retweets or something like that. But like that was something that I had to kind of build up to. And then content sharing and things. Content sharing will always be your lowest return. Almost no one will just share your content randomly. So like, don't be discouraged by that. People come for the other stuff, and then you funnel them to your content. They don't come for specifically like your YouTube videos, your Substack articles, or those kind of things. My conversion from Twitter to Substack would most people would be like, oh, I can't believe it's that low, but it's still way more people than I ever would have had without the Twitter. So you just have to keep that in mind. But I think, there's a lot more to it, but I think those would be kind of some of the basic things I learned.
Were there any memes or posts early on that are particularly memorable, where it was like one of those early pieces that blew up that you didn't expect?
Oh yeah, and I mean the "don't tap the sign" meme became the big thing that became the theme I was known for. And it's funny because literally when I first made that tweet, I immediately commented under it, "I'm going to get a lot of mileage out of this. Like, this is going to get used all the time." Yes. And sure enough, it did. So yeah, like taking my own tweets and turning them into a meme was a good idea, because you can just sit under people's stuff and post your tweets, but no one cares, right? Like, no one thinks about that. But if it's a meme, all of a sudden it's like a shareable thing. It's a community thing. It's, it grabs people's attention in a way that just like you reposting what you said wouldn't. So just repurposing your content in ways that kind of make it more shareable, more accessible, more eye-grabbing. It's exactly the same content. It's exactly the same thing that people technically do when they just copy the link from an old tweet and throw it under to be like, I predicted this. But setting it up in a visual way that presents it, that people can be captured by it, is just way more effective.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You definitely get a feel for what memes if you come up with one, what's going to go viral, right as you post it. And Logan Hall, who's here in New Founding.
Yeah, Logan's very good at it.
He's just really good. He has that intuition. He'll come up with something and be like, I'm going to get a ton of mileage out of this, or something that we come up with internally. He'll be like, yeah, that's going to blow up. And he just kind of has this sixth sense that tells him what's going to perform, what's not going to perform.
Yeah, once you've ridden the algorithm, once you felt it go up and down, it's a weird thing. It's hard to but once you've done it, you can see it. It's if you feel like the Matrix,
right.
I just read it now. I just see girl in a red dress. I just see it's like that is kind of a thing that happens. You're about to hit send on or something. You're like, this is going to get 1,000 retweets. I can feel it. I know it before I send it out. It's a weird thing, but it's real.
Yeah. What's your feel on, you touched on this briefly, but the Threads just came out a couple weeks ago. There's all sorts of chaos. Substack tried to do their notes thing. There's all sorts of chaos in sort of the Twitter clone space. What's your feel on how that's going to unfold here?
It's always weird. I mean, something will eventually kill Twitter, just like something killed MySpace, and something will eventually kill Facebook. These things seem unbeatable until they aren't. But the problem is, at least from what I can tell, I'm no expert, but from what I can tell, social media is built on, and really it's monopoly. Competing social media is bad, and that's something that conservatives don't understand. I'll just make my own, social media, and everybody will go there. Except that's not what happens, because the key to social media is everybody's on it. That's what makes it valuable. Facebook is valuable because you can get to any business or any person or any, this is why companies value it. It's why individuals value it. It's a shared place everybody spends time. And that's what makes it useful. This is also true for Twitter. It's useful because every influencer is on it. Twitter is relatively small for its social media user base, but the people who are on it are invaluable. It's all the government officials, it's all of the celebrities, it's all of the idea shapers, it's all of the political thinkers. That's where it happens. And so because of that, the influence of Twitter is just wildly outsized. I mean, there's literally I don't know, probably 25% to 30% of the journalist space that just exists to write about what they see on Twitter, right? Tim Pool literally built an empire on it. He just sat there and read Twitter, and basically built a mountain of money out of that. So it's a really outsized influence, and so it's really hard for me to see anything replacing Twitter in the near future. I mean, eventually, if enough people get off of it, or if it just becomes uncool enough, that might be the death. I mean, really, the old joke is, it's dead once your grandma's on it. And that might eventually kind of be what kills Facebook and Twitter. But as of now, I think it's pretty firmly set as having the right kind of monopoly.
Kind of on that note, one of the things about Twitter is that it has a particular kind of audience. And now you're on Twitter, you're on YouTube. Now you're also at the Blaze. Do you see it being at the Blaze strategic to get your content that was primarily only consumed on Twitter out to more less online, more normie type of folks who again may not have been on Twitter, but can now consume this information?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a massive opportunity. Obviously, like it's a huge thing to go from just being some guy with a YouTube channel to having that kind of access, because what Blaze does is it bridges the gap between the talk radio audience and the like online e-write audience. There's this kind of group in the middle that doesn't just listen to, like, I don't know, Dennis Prager or Michael Savage or somebody on talk radio, but also probably never would have like flipped on to listen to Sargon of Akkad talk about how he just wanted to play video games. And that like that in between space are like Blaze and Daily Wire consumers. And so being on the Blaze opens up obviously just a ton of opportunities. All of a sudden you're sitting right next to like Steve Dace and like Glenn Beck and, you know, all these like large names that like mainstream people who go to like all these conferences and things are paying attention to. And so they can just click on your content right next to these people. It also allows obviously like you to be on a lot more shows, to like, you know, to guest on those things, to kind of get the word out that way. And then it also allows a lot of people who like I've always highly respected. Like one of the main goals with my show is to bring on people who inspired me and had really powerful insights, but were just kind of always rejected by the mainstream or weren't really given their due by the mainstream. People like Dave the Distributist, who just, you know, absolutely deserve to be heard by a mainstream conservative audience, has really important things to say to them, but never would have shown up on, you know, some kind of mainstream conservative platform before that. And so I think that's a really great opportunity that this has afforded me.
Yeah, that's interesting. That Tucker seemed to have Tucker excuse me, Tucker seemed to bridge that gap too really well.
He did. Yes.
The frogs, as it were, the online rights, and then certainly the boomers, and ability to bridge that was pretty strategic back at Fox, and I think he's going to continue to do so in interesting ways moving forward. But Auron, so talking about Twitter, what you've been focusing on in terms of content and writing and thinking is this project around the total state. So you had a series of Substack posts that were essentially chapters of now a book that's being compiled from that writing. And I think people know you because of your thinking on this subject. Can you give us some 30,000 foot view of what the total state project is and what do you mean by the total state?
Sure. So as we have kind of noticed already earlier in the podcast, like politics doesn't just work the way that it was supposed to, right? Like the branches of government, Montesquieu, they just, it's not real. That's not actually how power works. That's not actually how government works. And so that's why initially I was fascinated by writers like Mencius Mollberg, Curtis Yarvin. Mencius Mollberg was his pen name. Guys like Nick Land. They were explaining a different way to think about power, a different way to look at and understand kind of the way that power works. And this, of course, they weren't just building this out of thin air. They had read guys like Hans Hermann Hoppe or James Burnham. They had looked at older political thinkers like Vilfredo Pareto or Gaetano Mosca, and they had taken their work and kind of updated it. And so I went back and I basically read everything. I just went back and read anything I could get a hold of. And what I kept seeing was these threads. James Burnham, of course, famously posited the idea of the Managerial Revolution, which was the idea that really, while we think that like communism and Western liberal democracies and fascism were like three really different government styles, they actually were really similar. They were all operating under a managerial structure. and that managerial structure had more or less replaced kind of the bourgeoisie capitalism that most people think of when they actually think of places like the United States. Like most people think that America operates under kind of this free market capitalism, but it doesn't at all. It operates under a managerial structure of kind of massified institutions. And the more I read about this, the more I realized that this didn't just apply to that one area, but this, this had really been copied into every part of our life, from our religions to our social structures, our schools, our businesses. Everything operated on kind of under this managerial structure. And because of that, we have a state that has grown well beyond the formal bounds of government. The three branches that are described in the Constitution are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to our actual governing apparatus, which is largely made up of our non-elected federal bureaucracy, our educational institutions, academia, our media outlets, and then kind of our corporations all actually kind of lag behind rather than lead in the way that many people think of that. And all these managerial institutions share similar structures, they share similar values, they share similar goals. And because of that, they kind of create a total system of control that weaves itself through all aspects of our lives. It's not just on the side of like this public-private distinction where like the government is over here and then, our religious beliefs and our private lives are over there. No, this kind of works itself through everything. And I kept finding this over again in the most surprising places. People like C.S. Lewis were writing about this. People like Auron MacIntyre, who's an ethicist, who's an ethical philosopher of ethics, was writing about managerialism, not because he cared specifically about like political power, but because it had such an impact on our ethical beliefs that you have to acknowledge its presence there. And I just kind of noticed that, again, this is just everywhere, and this has impacted every aspect of life. And I started to bring that all together, all these disparate writers, these different sources from politics and religion and ethics and philosophy, and bring all the things that they had said about this and turning it into kind of one overarching narrative of kind of this total state takeover, this managerial class that had built up and taken over almost every aspect of kind of our political and social landscape.
What are some of the incentives or structures of the managerial class? You talk about government, politics, religious structures. Now, just our regular lives are all share this managerial class structure or arrangement. What are the incentives of the managerial class? What does this lead to?
So one of the main things that kind of defines the managerial apparatus across domains is its separation from ownership and operation. So originally in the world, we had many different spheres of social influence. The government was, of course, one, but let's say you had a king, he had his own influence, but he was reliant on these different barons, right? These different nobles. And each one of them had their own local sphere of influence. And the king really couldn't get anything done unless he kind of made deals with the local influence that was bartered by those guys. But it wasn't just the barons that had influence. Church had its own powerful influence. If you couldn't really get things done that directly contradicted kind of the moral and social leadership of the church, because the church wasn't just some place you went on Sunday and listened to some music you liked. It was the social center of your community. It was the moral center of your community. It was the thing handing out. Charity. If someone was homeless, it was the place where your kids got married. It was the only way you'd be recognized as legitimately married. Like it served a powerful function. It had its own sphere of domain. We also saw this with kind of communities. They had different organizations. They had different community leadership, and all of those things competed for kind of control, which meant it was really hard to centralize in a totalizing way this power. But what happened is, as society grew and the scale of society grew, we learned that differentiation, that like specialization, is way more powerful. And so we started to learn that like we could have people who owned an organization, but in order for that organization to scale up and operate like all these technical aspects that now needed to exist, we needed a class of people who were trained in managerial techniques, who could operate large bureaucracies of people, some who were involved in logistics and shipping, some who were involved in manufacturing, some who were involved in finance, some who were involved in tax compliance, some who were involved in just all these different specific specialized areas. And that separated the owners of those things from the operators of those things. And now the people who owned them were the ones who felt more of the consequences. You know, things went good, they got the benefits. When things went bad, they didn't. But the people who actually operated them, they weren't incentivized the same way. They kind of got paid more or less no matter what. And so their goal was less about the primary mission of the organization and more about the accumulation of their own power within the organization. So like, to give a concrete example, you're running a business as the owner, or if you're a stockholder, like, you want to make money, right? That's your whole purpose. But the stockholder doesn't have a lot of like individual power over what the corporation is doing. However, the managers, they do want to make money for the stockholder on some level. But if I'm a mid-level manager, I'm not really probably doing a whole lot one way or another to increase the profit of the company. I'm more interested in making sure that my job is secure. Well, how do I secure my job? Well, I accumulate the most amount of power possible to like kind of my middle management position. I want to become as indispensable as possible. And that might mean actually making the company run worse sometimes. Like, I might make choices that actually hurt the company, but make myself indispensable. And if you get enough people over time, and we've seen the explosion of managers in all of these things, right? If you want to look at any chart, you can look at academia, you can look at business, you can look at the military. Like, managers have exploded, like not just 2, 3, 400%, like on a regular basis, they increase. And that's because there's an incentive for the managerial class to grow their power. And that is what we're seeing kind of dislocate the normal relationship between like performance of institutions and who they serve, as opposed to who actually operates them.
It seems like this is the soil upon which we see things like COVID experts grow, the Twitter files and the Twitter kind of unraveling when Elon bought it and, cut 90% of the people there and safety teams out, and all these people whose job is, they're technically working for an organization for the good of that organization, for the good of the customer, or it could be the good of the citizen. That's on paper what they should be doing. But what they really are there to do is secure their own grip on the levers and the buttons of power in that organization in a way that just extends their hold on power, in power in that particular role. Is this what does this do? What does the managerial class do to people? How we think about people?
Well, the managerial class needs to create efficiency. That's the whole reason they have power, is that they create this miracle of efficiency. Like, otherwise you wouldn't hire the middle manager, but they make something happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. And they make it happen in the most efficient way possible. But in order to like generate efficiency in large bureaucratic organizations, what you need to do is standardize kind of responses. So, if I am going to make an assembly line, I need to make every part interchangeable, so that like some random guy can just come in and pick up the work where it got started, or I can, I can easily swap things out. I can't have any one thing be like too complicated or, something become too valuable, because like it's really essential that everything be generally applicable to every part of this process. This also transfers over to humans. If I'm an HR director, I want everyone to abide by the exact same code, have the exact same opinions, bring the exact same kind of attitude to the table, because any kind of moral or cultural or ideological particularity of an individual person is a bit of resistance against my system, right? I need everybody to be on the same page at all times so we can produce the thing most efficiently. If you can't do that because, well, your religion says you can't work on Sunday, or it says you can't work after sundown, or because you have too many kids and you can't work, 7 days a week because like you actually have to go take care of a family, then those are all barriers to like my efficiency. And so it's really important to homogenize and wear down all those differences. And this is why we see this attempt not just at like a business management level, but in our entire culture to try to basically homogenize everything. We talk about diversity, but we don't have any. We specifically work to eliminate diversity. Yeah, okay, so you made something look like the Burger King Kids Club. Good for you. But actually, the only reason you did that is so that everyone kind of loses their attachment to any particular religion, any particular community, any particular nation, any particular way of being. Excuse me. And they all get homogenized into kind of one thing. So everyone can listen to the same background music. Everyone can be motivated by the same poster. Everybody can, be unified behind whatever corporate do-goodery we're doing this month. Congratulations, you just saved the trans whales. Like everyone can kind of be motivated by the same empty gestures. And so it's really important that across our culture and across our institutions, we homogenize the way that people interact with those institutions so they can generate the most efficiency through the application of managerial techniques.
Perhaps the craziest, one of the craziest effects I've noticed of this is consequences, really, is how people now, we've been in the managerial mindset for so long that people, for the most part now, don't see any other way of thinking about reality. They just assume this is just how it works. And again, you got to rely on the mid-level experts to tell you what to think, the mid-level communicators to craft the narrative, the mid-level HR ladies to tell you what you can and can't do in your job, the mid-level administrators at educational institutions to tell you what job you can or can't have, what credentials are valuable or not. Do you see it that way? Like, is this sort of infected at such levels that now is just how we think about the world? Like, this is just metaphysically true.
Yeah, we really have internalized it in every way, which is why I think the total state is such a kind of a good term for it, because it has become totalizing. We can't imagine a world where we can't put everything on a spreadsheet, right? Which is why like so many people have a problem just having any meaning in their lives. Like that's why we have so many people who are completely deracinated, disconnected, because they're like, well, if I can't chart success as some kind of variable in an Excel sheet, then it just doesn't matter, right? Like the only thing is like what I can quantify. But of course, nothing that really matters in life fits on a spreadsheet. Thomas Carlyle warned people about this. He called it economics the dismal science, because it would just make it impossible for people to think any other way. All they can think about is efficiency. All they can think of is the reign of quantity, the tyranny of quantity. They can't ever think about the quality. They can't think about those in betweens. He said, we're going to sit around and talk about the numbers to try to like figure out what the condition of life is in England. But the best way to know what the condition of life is in England is to talk to the average Englishman. But that doesn't really show up in a spreadsheet the same way. Like you have to just walk the roads and talk to people. And that's the kind of the thing that blew me away when I first kind of encountered this kind of thinking, because I was totally bought into like this neocon mainstream GOP thing. Like, TVs are cheap. Yeah, man, another flat screen TV for $200. Capitalism, man, killing it. This is what life is all about. Like, obviously, we're the best country in the world. But like, the more I realized that none of my friends could like get married and have kids and expect to own a home and expect to have like extended family that functioned and get plugged into a religious community and find meaning, the more I realized like, none of this, like all these numbers going up, the GDP line go up doesn't matter, because the quality of life of everyone around me is kind of plummeting. And so, yeah, we're in a real, we have a real problem, because we don't even know how to begin to start thinking about kind of the problem we're in, because every time you try to make an argument of like, no, this isn't what life is about, this isn't what matters, someone runs up to you with a spreadsheet or a bunch of statistics and says, this is the only way to understand our problem. Like, if you can't sit around and spit out a bunch of statistics or verified studies on any given issue, then you don't know what you're talking about. It's like, actually, no, you relying on that stuff is just shows how impossible it is for you to think about anything. All you know how to do is appeal to authority, but people don't see it that way. Like, science, reason, this is all we've got, right? So those are the only ways we can approach this stuff.
Yeah. I'm reminded of, so I'm reading through the Voyage of the Dawn Treader with my son right now, reading out loud to him. And Eustace is this character who he's read all these books. He's very well read on paper in terms of the amount of content he's read. But Lewis describes him as this boy who's only read books about shipping and logistics and spreadsheets and efficiency. And he's a total kind of early acolyte into the managerial class. And when he confronts the real world where there are dragons and beasts and magic and interpersonal dynamics and storms and adventures and difficult, dangerous things, he doesn't know what to do with any of that. Like it doesn't map all the content, all the knowledge that's all aimed at particular efficiencies. All that content doesn't serve him at all as he's out there in the wild, in an adventure with the rest of the crew.
Yeah, this is the recurring thing with Lewis. The Hideous Strength is also much like that, right? It's a bunch of professors sitting around and they can't recognize kind of this evil takeover of demons that's happening because they can't imagine anything beyond kind of what they've read in books. Same thing occurs in Till We Have Faces, which is probably the most underrated C.S. Lewis book of all time. But the fox there is actually meant to stand in for his tutor, who taught him that Christianity was stupid and ridiculous, and the ideas of mythology and things were foolish. And that was something he had to personally overcome, obviously, on his journey to Christianity, realizing that these things are far more true than anything that I kind of read in a book or that my master put down when I was in school. But that's something that that's an issue he recurringly includes in his work.
Yeah.
It seems like that character of the efficiency focused person has existed. I mean, obviously exists now in the Industrial Revolution, the industrialization of factories. That was a key character in like a Dickens novel or something like that. But even like you're saying, in a novel set in more Greek or Roman times, I'm sure there were efficiency guys in Rome who wanted to make everyone a cog and will everything to be flawlessly efficient. How much do you think of that? Entrepreneur grows a company, it becomes successful, he's focused on making it great, and then eventually it becomes a money machine, managers come in, that sort of growth and decay cycle. How much of that is just a how the world works, sort of a cycle that's always been going on, and how much do you think is unique to our technology and time?
That's a good question. I think there is a real morphology, like you're talking about. I think there is a real recurring cycle of kind of, the civilizations, businesses, organizations. They start with kind of this animating singular force, this vision, this ideal that is usually driven by one or a very small group of people. They kind of create success. They defeat outward enemies. They kind of climb to the top. Eventually you get to what Oswald Spengler would call the civilizational phase, which a lot of people hear that and they're like, oh, that's the good phase. Like, no, actually that's the bad phase. That's when things go awry, because all that stuff that was animated by kind of vision, by the metaphysics, by the spiritual, suddenly has to be transferred into more technical things like constitutions, documents, procedures, best practices. So now, instead of just being like, everyone at the company knows this is how we work, or everyone in the church knows this is what we're about because they were there and they felt the thing and they're animated the spirit. Instead, everyone's reading bylaws and procedures and guidelines, and those kind of bloodless manifestations of what made the organization or the nation or the business great can actually still get you by for a long time. But eventually the interests become too divided. The business becomes just a cash cow. The nation just becomes a place to get rich. The organization just becomes a place to acquire power. and eventually like all the vultures just pick it clean and it kind of decays and dies. I think that the way it's happening now is very particular and noticeable and unifies a particular class of people because of our managerial structure. But I think the pattern itself is something that repeats over and over again and can never really be escaped. Nothing that we humans build will ever be eternal in that sense. And so I think that's something that we can always see.
Auron, what kind of people does this game, if we want to call it that way, incentivize? Like what kind of person sees these rules and gets to rise to the top?
So Vilfredo Pareto had a theory of kind of the different things that animate a society. He called them residues. There's like 7 of them, or 6 or 7 of them, but it gets a little technical. It's the whole like series of sociology. So like Machiavelli just called these 2 personality types like the fox and the lion, and that's kind of an easier way to think about them. And so what Pareto said about these personality types is like when something is being built, whether it's a nation or an organization or whatever, you start off tend to be with like lion personalities. They tend to be those that are kind of bold. They're comfortable with the use of force. They're the kind of people who lead armies, and they can cut into a wilderness and settle it, or they can protect you from outside enemies. They can kind of bring order to a lawless land. Like these are kind of your founders. But over time, as your society becomes more secure and more complex, you get the rise of foxes. And foxes aren't bad, to be clear. This isn't like the good guys versus the bad guys. These are just like different modes of being, different personalities that arise in leadership classes, different types of elites. And the foxes tend to be the people who are better at like combining ideas, working with complex systems, coming up with new things. And that's why they tend to arise after things have become more peaceful, more settled, because you don't need that like confident competence with the physical. You need people who can kind of like solve complex economic issues or issues of production or diplomacy, those kind of things. And they serve like their place. And you always should have a mix of the two. Like a healthy elite, a healthy organization is always going to have a mix of these personalities. But as things kind of get safe, you start to see an incentive structure that benefits foxes the most, because they're the ones inside of safe structure where like decisiveness isn't necessary. They're the best at like weaseling around, changing the meaning of things, manipulating rules, manipulating procedures. And so they kind of gain power. And as we can tell now, like we are just built with foxes, right? We're just stuffed with foxes at this point. This is why like every corporation now has kind of moved towards hiring a lot more women, right? Like they don't want guys who are going to like make violent outbursts. They don't want guys who are going to rub people the wrong way. They want kind of agreeable people who are really good at following and enforcing rules, right? Like that's, so you're seeing a shift in the way that a lot of organizations hire, the way that they, they acquire personnel, because they're not really interested in kind of the same aspects as they might have been when they would have been in more competition, when there would have been more, when a more aggressive spirit would have been needed. They're interested in like safe, measured growth under bureaucratic, kind of conditions. And so we're seeing the reign of foxes right now because they're the ones whose personality sets are kind of optimized to get the incentives that are currently handed out by the system.
Feels like there's a children's book title here, The Fox in the Longhouse.
Or The Reign of Foxes.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, you can correct me in the statistic, but I think our talent network, one of the things we do in New Founding is talent placement, talent network. I think it's like 98% guys. I think just temperamentally, it attracts a lot of lions, guys who want to build in particular directions that are not going to be constrained by red tape and long housing. And
yeah, I mean, we've talked about different organizational structures, especially like early on at a startup. It tends to often follow more of like what you think of like as a war party or raiding party grouping, where you maybe have one leader who's a strong leader, but then beneath it you got a bunch of people who are going out and hunting and bring things back, or you're attacking an issue. Everybody's working on it on their own, but also together. But there's not a a super developed, extensive hierarchy and rules and all these things, versus you get a much more larger established company, and it's more like a settlement. It's more like a civilization where you're like, okay, these people farm the beets, and these people are making the clothes and the shoes, and you do have more of a satellite, lots more hierarchy and lots more structure, and it just is a different makeup. And so, yeah, I do think those kind of war party startup organizations attract a certain type of person versus those larger, later stage organizations.
I think in the war party stuff, and this connects to something, Aurons, you've written about the rise of the Midwits. In a smaller group like the war party or the raiding party startup, you're connected to reality. You're a smaller group, so each guy, you can assess each guy very objectively. Like, are they going out and killing and hunting and bringing something back that benefits their community, right? When you have a massive organization of 10,000 people, whatever, like on Twitter, good example of this, or the NIH, whatever, National Institute of Health, you have all these people who are so far removed from sort of reality. Their will doesn't really shape reality or bring things back in a quantifiable, easily objective, quantifiable way. You can say that guy's producing this much for the community. You can sort of sneak under, get by, not do much, but you're still in the organization. It incentivizes a certain kind of person to be in that structure that you've talked to about as the rise of the Midwit. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, the Midwit phenomenon is something that is for sure a product of our separation from kind of practical application. But it's also just kind of like a social response. So like the Midwit is the person who is smarter than average. Like, they are intelligent. It's not that they are intelligent, but they're only slightly more intelligent than average. So they're never going to be like the smartest kid in the class, but they don't really have any other defining feature. They're probably not good at sports. They're probably not good at, music or something else. So like, this is going to be the only thing that they can really feel achievement about. And so they love to find ways to kind of like make themselves feel superior, but they're deeply insecure because they're like not really, again, like the smartest. They're above average intelligence, but they're never going to be the top dog. So they're always looking for that advantage to kind of like yell down to people. The perfect example is like somebody who loves to correct grammar online, right? Like, correcting grammar online shows no actual intelligence. It's not an argument. It doesn't show your ability to think critically. It's simply the fact that you might be able to regurgitate a rule better than the person next to you, and that kind of like makes you feel superior. They're the guy in class who is always like, it's pronounced this way, like that's your Midwit. And so like they love kind of the social justice stuff, the progressive stuff, because it's all about like shifting jargon, right? Progressives love to code switch all the time. That's why, it can go from people of color to colored people to, all the, it's black. No, it's African American. There's always some new term, so that you can just turn around and correct someone. That's what it's about. They don't really care about the term. No one actually finds it offensive. They just want to be able to correct the term. So you just need a new one every 5 or 10 years. So someone has the opportunity to correct it. And the ability of Midwits to like keep up with that social code and kind of spew it back out at people kind of makes them feel elevated. And so they tend to be people who acquire a lot of like unusable knowledge that doesn't really find a home or an application, but does allow them to kind of blurt out these things that make them sound slightly more intelligent than the people around them.
Yeah, it's sort of living life by the HR employee handbook in a way, where one of the rules of rhetoric is, you define your terms. Whoever defines the term first wins, and this is defining terms to the limit, and they get to tell you what to say. Oh, what, that's not allowed anymore. Now the term is this. Oh, that's not the term anymore. And now you can do this. Oh, actually you can't do that anymore. And it certainly gives them a level of control, but it's not real sort of like fundamental power. It's a almost synthetic power over people's lives. That's asphyxiating, really.
And because they borrow that power, like because it's not earned by their own natural elevation in a hierarchy, they know that they're entirely dependent on the regime. So like that's a huge part of where we're at now too, is so much of our ruling apparatus right now is an inverted hierarchy, elevated only because of its loyalty to the regime. And that makes all of these people, like, you might have noticed that no matter how much these people win, they act like they're about to be genocided, right? Like they say this all the time. It's wild. They're like, oh yeah, they're gonna, it's a trans genocide. Why? Oh, because we can't let you mutilate kids. Like, that, like, they act, no matter how much they win socially, they become more and more insecure. And that's because they know that their power is entirely dependent on this artificial ruling class. If at any moment, like, reality reasserted itself, they would be dropped back into like the dregs of society where they belong. And so they fight with a revolutionary fervor, because it really is an existential question for them. Like, they understand that, like, they should not be on the top of the social pyramid, and they have been purely elevated by their like unswerving devotion to this ideology that becomes more and more cartoonish by the day. But that clown world is a uniform, right? Like, they have the ability to kind of know who's on their side by who will say the most ridiculous things. But they're terrified because at any moment, if this goes away, if at any moment, like, the evil red staters gain any kind of power, these guys will just drop back down again.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. They really have to. They're dependent on the structure of reality that they've created to remain in power. So, what's the ideal? If the total state is where we're at right now, and not what we want to continue to see, what's the ideal structure of reality look like in your mind?
Yeah, so this is always a dangerous game to play, right? Like, Plato, let's make a republic.
Yes,
and it just turns out being horrific. So like, this smarter minds than mine have attempted at this and are to this day mocked for it. So here's what I'll say. I think Joseph de Maistre is right that constitutions and governments are reflections of the people. And so each people will have a specific type of government and a specific type of society that mirrors their traditions, their heritage, their ways of being, their folkways. Like, and so saying like democracy or republics or monarchies or whatever is just the universal best way to organize is a failing. Like, I think that's actually our problem right now, is we tried to take Western liberal democracy and just apply its kind of ideas to every single aspect of life in every other country, no matter what their traditions were, no matter the disposition of their people, no matter the nature of like what this particular infrastructure or culture or organization does. We just kind of copy pasted this onto everything. But history is not over. Like, history is the story of these different ways of being, these different organizations clashing. And one of the reasons that we kind of ended up with a total state is we tried to eradicate those things. We tried to get rid of of politics at all. We just tried to universalize everything and say there is only one political solution. There's only one way to organize anything. Everything is a mass bureaucracy. Everything is a quantifiable, systematized scientific understanding. Everything is a Western liberal democracy. And that like need to homogenize everything is part of the total state, is part of the managerial revolution, but it is a denial of reality. And so I think what's going to happen, I think what we're going to see is that this kind of globalized network of Western liberal democracies and bureaucratized structures is slowly going to collapse under its own weight. We're already seeing that now. We're already seeing supply chains break down. We're already seeing standards of living falling apart. We're already seeing the stability of kind of the geopolitical hegemony of Western liberal democracies start to fail. And as that happens, we'll see the reemergence of other ways of being, other types of social organizations. And it won't be one. It won't be like all of a sudden it's all monarchies, or all of a sudden it's all theocracies, or it will be a reemergence of more natural hierarchies, more natural social organizations that comply with the ways of being of those particular people groups. And so what we're going to see is, I think, the rise of actual diversity, the kind that lets individual groups, individual nations, individual people organize the way they want to, rather than the way that the NATO says they have to.
Right. It's like rise of actual diversity and actual sovereignty.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting going back to what you're saying about how something like democracy gets pushed into everything. I remember seeing this. We've all seen it, early on, especially on Twitter. You see, there was a way which Silicon Valley founders were describing whatever tool thing they were building. Like this is mid 2010s as the democratization of X. Like we're democratizing content creation or social graphs. It was so boring and totally ridiculous. But what was interesting in those statements was this assumption that democracy was sort of the ultimate good. That if you democratize whatever, democratize insert thing, immediately that was perfect, good, wonderful.
Yeah, I think that's still if you ask someone on the street, that's still the attitude of most people to say, like, what's the ultimate form of government? And like, boom, check mark, democracy. Like, we figured it out, guys.
Yes.
Like, we got it.
Right.
We just got to spread that around the globe,
Exactly.
and we're set. And you're saying that, I mean, that decision or that attempt to sort of just pause government cycles or experimentation or localities just at liberal democracy across the globe is both stagnation, but then also buildup that's going to decay into other types.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you guys are aware. This guy Francis Fukuyama came up with the end of history, right? Like is the essay and then the book, and is all about exactly this thing. Like basically we solved everything. Capitalism is the only economic system. Western liberal democracy is the only government system. A massive bureaucratic organization is the only way things. And to be fair to Fukuyama, like originally he was like, actually, we are going to be stuck in this, but there are going to be like a lot of problems. We're going to have to solve these. Funny enough, he's become the caricature that everyone used to say he was. Like he used to have some nuance in this thought, but now he's just been like, nope, anytime it fails, it's actually because we didn't democracy hard enough. And so like, we'll just democracy harder. But yeah, I think it really is this situation where we're coming to the realization that the promises of liberalism, and here I mean like classical liberalism, not left-wing progressive thought, weren't true. Like there isn't some permanent scientific way to just lock in forever the perfect style of self-governance. That's just never going to happen. We are a nation, as my buddy Steve Dace says, we're a nation of political will, and we always were, and we always will be. And if you continue to operate into this idea that it's only mass bureaucracies and liberal democracy and capitalism from here on out, then you're going to get your worldview is about to break down in a very real way, because I don't think those structures can last forever. I think we're starting to see them fall apart in many ways. And the question is, who will have the vision to look beyond that? That's going to be the real question of, I think, our next epoch, is who tried to cling to this stuff as the ship sank, and who was willing to say, nope, we understand this period of history is over, and we're ready to build for the future. We're ready to make those new institutions. We're ready to forge those new ways of life. We're really ready to create those new communities. Those are the people who get to make it to the other side, I think.
Yeah, HR ladies be damned. We're gonna chart a different course. Or I'm curious. So we've talked about on this point. We've talked about how bureaucratic democracy incentivizes the foxes and people on the left to continue to pursue that kind of structure of reality. But on the right, I'm thinking of something like people like the boomers, for example. The two biggest sins for a boomer are being called a racist and not believing in democracy. So how is this structure of reality sold to the right, to the conservatives? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think in two ways. One, to be fair, like on the democracy side, they were sold kind of the idea that this was always what the founders intended, and they wanted to conserve it. I think if you look at the founders, it's undeniable that they did have some degree of faith in a more liberal notion of government. Like John Locke is just, Thomas Jefferson was just ripping off John Locke all day long in the Declaration of Independence. Again, Montesquieu and right. All over the Constitution. So like, obviously there is some truth to that. However, I don't think you would have had a hard time if you look at what the founders actually created, saying that this was like just a democratic government. Now, conservatives love to say this is a constitutional republic, and it's like, okay, cool, but like, when are you getting rid of the direct election of senators, right? An actual republic has a very limited voter base. It has a very limited franchise. It's tied to a specific set of people with a specific kind of background and kind of set of skills, and it's still got limited influence on the government. No Republicans pushing to go back to that, right? So like, they're not really interested in constitutional republic either. They're not actually interested in returning to that either. So there's kind of a sleight of hand that gets played there, where they think they're defending kind of the founding principles, but nothing they're defending fits with actually what your founding principles kind of were at the beginning. So that there's that kind of disconnection. Also, a lot of people have like kind of a cartoon understanding of American history. Like, the Republic has been dead for a long time, guys. Like, our first Constitution wasn't the Constitution. It was the Articles of Confederation, and like, the Constitution was just illegally passed to get rid of it. Like, a bunch of bankers and guys who worked the harbor didn't like the farmers revolting, and so they just decided to switch the government of the United States on a whim. Also, like, we had a civil war, and we just kind of suspended all of the Constitution to do that, and then we like did the same thing again with FDR. So the idea that we just have had one consistent rule of law, and that has been our tradition throughout, is something that is kind of a fiction that most people, even on the Republican side, believe, because they're just not familiar with the actual history of the United States. And then, like, to the other side of that, I think a lot of boomers are very scared of the racism accusation, because they don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Like, they don't want their kids to hate them. Like, they don't want to be that person standing around with a hate-filled sign, in the history book when they start talking about integration. Now, to be very fair to people, like, you actually shouldn't hate people based on their race. Like, you really should, like, especially as Christians, we have a duty to treat people, even the stranger, with a certain level of respect. Now, I think a lot of people abuse that and say that means like, then the stranger has the right to like enter our borders at any time and access to all of our social services, which is not what that means. But it is true that like, we have to treat people with respect and dignity. Like, that is a moral failing of people. But that got turned into like this accusation that just destroys people's lives. Like, if anybody just says the wrong thing or has any thought outside of a very prescribed window, then they're absolutely terrified of it. And like, that's a terrible way to be, because there are real issues. Like, you can't look at something, we just got rid of affirmative action, right? A lot of conservatives are like, these liberals keep saying that like, there'll be fewer black kids and Hispanic kids going to college if we get rid of affirmative action. They don't really have faith in those people. It's like, well, actually, they're just looking at statistics. Like, affirmative action existed because, well, fewer black kids and fewer Latino kids were going to college under those rules. So that's just an objective look at what is a statistical reality in those situations. But conservatives are so desperate to like never look at those things that they will just completely ignore like reality that even progressives are acknowledging about, the woke is more correct than the mainstream in this particular case, as Kofi Annan, famously says. And so it's one of those things where it is built on a good principle that like, we should be treating people with respect. We should be treating people, with dignity and understanding, but it gets weaponized into a principle of, I need to be worried about this so much at any time because it could just destroy my life and my history, my legacy at any moment. And so it's really important for me to play by every rule the left ever utters, because otherwise everything could just be lost.
Yeah, this is how we kind of end up adopting the entire playbook of our enemies to police ourselves, to structure ourselves, to look at reality, measure it. How do you go about what are your thoughts on red pilling the normies, as it were, waking them up in ways that doesn't totally destroy them and fracture them, but also gets them to look at reality as it is and charge forward?
I think you have to keep like two things in mind when you're talking about red pilling the normies. Like, the idea that we just wake up people and then like everybody's on our side and we win is a bad way to understand how politics works, right? Like public opinion is driven by elite minorities, and here I don't mean like people from a specific like skin color, ethnicity. I mean minorities in the sense of small groups of organized people. And so like small groups of organized people will always be kind of the vanguard that kind of drives political change. So the critical thing, if you want to like change public opinion, is not to like get the word out to as many people, though eventually you'll do that. Like that will be a consequence of what you're doing. But the main thing is to control like institutions and kind of narrative shaping organizations and kind of pathways that then kind of produce this stuff. This is what the left understands way better than the right, that we're in a media controlled state. Like, yeah, the government has the formal power, but the kind of public opinion is what keeps them in power. And so control of public opinion is where power actually lies. Control of the narrative is way more important than formal control of a government structure, unless that formal control of the government structure gives you the ability to immediately change the narrative, which sometimes it does. But understanding the real goal in our current political structure is narrative change. So like most people, especially conservatives, are just reinforcers of rules they've been told. So they support things because they've been told to support them. Like, this is the norm. It's my job to protect the norm. I am dispositional. My disposition is to protect the norm. And so whatever the norm is, whatever power structure has pointed me towards and incentivized me to protecting, is what I'll protect. Like, a lot of people talk about kind of the awful problem, right? Like the kind of the affluent white urban liberal female problem, because they like so vociferously enforce a lot of these rules. But the reason they do this is just because that's how they would be dispositionally anyway, right? Like, and so if you change public opinion and you change incentive, you will change what those people enforce. There are other factors. It's more complicated than that. There are certain things that do feed into that otherwise, but a large swath of kind of public opinion could just be changed by that. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't like a more effective way to do your public communication now. And so, like, for instance, framing is really important. When I try to bring a more kind of dissident right idea to a normal audience, I always try to connect it to something they already value. I try to explain, okay, you care about family formation, but you've been told that like corporations are your buddy. So let's explain how actually the thing you really want, which is better family formation. You want your kid to be able to get married and have kids of their own and own a home and be able to stay in your hometown and not have to move across the country to chase some awful corporate job. If you want to do that, then that means like certain parts of the corporate structure might have to go, right? And they are far more willing, rather than just coming up to them and being like, capitalism's bad, coming to them with their own concerns and their own values facing forward, can allow them to hear things that otherwise they would immediately recoil from because it clashes with some other narrative they were already taught. And so I think whenever you're trying to kind of communicate that to a more mainstream audience, put it in a frame where it connects to something they already value. That way they can see you share values with them. And now it's friends talking about what's best for their community and not adversaries debating over like what values are true.
Yeah, or pushing the idea so the dissident right idea so kind of starkly without any connection to what they value, as you're saying, that it scares them, and it's, you like it or not, that's going to be a reaction on the right. These ideas are scary. We don't want to deal with them. So, close my eyes, plug my ears. Don't want to listen to them. Or get my notes here. So talking about elites and the small group of elites that control the narrative, another thing you've written about as part of the total state dynamic is this idea of elite overproduction. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that shapes the world we live in?
Sure. So in a normal society, you're going to have what's called a circulation of elites. Vilfredo Pareto talked about this, and he said, a healthy society is always going to let certain people in to the elite to kind of have new blood, to make a better, to make a better elite. They're not going to become stagnant. They're not going to become locked in. If you do get that, then that's where you kind of see a problem. But what we ended up with was kind of this system of perverse incentives when it comes to a production of elites. So at first, we obviously had a kind of varied entry way into elite status. You could be intelligent. You could build a business. You could be very good in a martial sense, a leadership sense. You could fight honorably in the military. You could come from a landed noble, kind of background. We didn't call them landed nobles, but they were. And so like we had a variety of different ways that one could kind of enter the elite structure. And then kind of after World War II, we get the GI Bill, and we've kind of conquered the world in a lot of ways. And you don't really need as varied, you certainly don't need as many kind of martial caste elites. You don't need as many varied types of elites. And so we kind of funnel everything through the college system. And all of a sudden, college becomes like this gateway to the middle and upper classes for people who came from other classes. And because the government is now like subsidizing that ability to kind of go to college, there's incentive structures built in to like kind of treat this as the final way to like kind of build an elite class.
The official credentialing system. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And the problem is that then that becomes like the only way that people start to differentiate whether or not somebody is qualified for something. So all of a sudden, like everybody who wanted a top position needed a college degree, but everybody who didn't fit into the top position, well, the middle positions, you had an up if you had a college degree. Well, eventually so many college degrees fill the middle positions that now you have to have a college degree for the middle positions, and a college degree is a bonus for a lower position. And then the lower positions all become, and before you know it, people need a degree to like manage a Foot Locker, like something that would never have required a degree in the first place. And so what you end up is kind of like this elite overproduction cycle where a lot of people who probably should have been able to just get like a middle management job or a low level management job, kind of just earn like a honorable middle class income at like kind of like a skilled labor position. All of a sudden they have to go into debt, go to, college for 4+ years. And when they get through it, they've gone through the same process that people who used to go to higher class things went through. And so they expect like they should be part of the elite, right? Like I went to college and, 20 years ago, people went to college, got like big jobs. Why am I not getting big jobs? And so you just end up in this kind of like a credential inflation cycle of collapse where like every job requires more and more ridiculous amounts of higher education for positions that never would have required it previously. All the while, like people are going to these institutions and going into this debt thinking that like they're going to be the elite leaders of society when really they're actually just acquiring the ability to manage a Foot Locker. They obviously end up kind of getting pretty angry about that.
Yeah, what ends up happening, it seems like it just flattens people into, again, going back to managerial class and bureaucratic structures, it flattens people into queryable data units where you can say, do you have X degree? Yes. Do you have X skills? Do you have A, B, C skill? Yep. Okay, then you fit in this particular role. Oh, guess what? We also have 10 million people that query the same skills and the same piece of paper that you do. So you're not actually that unique, and you're replaceable with, anybody else that has the same skill set. Josh and I worked at a workforce analytics company a while back, and there was a particular shift this direction where companies were looking to use our data to find people to hire. And the more and more so, the requests from customers became more and more mechanized and almost just flat, where they saw people as pure economic units that were composed of a degree, a set of skills that you could list out on a resume, and that was pretty much it. No thought was given to complexity of a person as a whole. Now, skills, of course, are important, and having studied certain things can be helpful in if you're an engineer or a doctor or whatever. But in general, it flattened people into these units that could just be plugged into a particular slot and pulled out at a moment's notice. And you realize, like, you're thinking about people who, the moment you go to college and you enter this river, you've bought into the structure of reality that turns you into one of those things. A lot of people could have been happy, to your point earlier, could have been happier in older structures of reality, being a cobbler in their town or selling insurance or building houses in ways that didn't require them to buy into this entire inflationary credential system. Could have had normal lives, been happy people. But the moment you step foot into this rushing stream, you're swept into it with millions of other people, not just in the US, but literally across the world entire.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of it too, right? Like it actually heavily disincentivizes community interaction and building by these corporate structures, right? Because what it does is it lets some hiring manager unload all responsibility. Like, okay, I hired this guy, but he had the credential, right? Like he had all the check boxes. She met a certain number of diversity quotas. And so like the person's actual performance, I can't be held liable because I followed the set of steps, right? Also, it transfers like the responsibility of the community investment by the business, because it used to be that if a business was involved in a community, it was drawing on the labor of the community. The trade-off was it improved the labor of the community. Like I look at this person, I interview them, I realize that they've got management written on them, and I put them in a position where like they can be tracked to start building that skill set. I train them. I give them the skills that I want them to have. And that means I provide another skilled leader to the community. But instead, our corporations are entirely about extraction, right? We don't build the skills inside the community where we operate. We extract those skills from across the country or now across the entire globe, right? So we're brain draining every community and every nation now across the world to just crunch them under kind of the feet of these like large production machines, rather than these companies investing into like the skill set and the ability of the leaders inside the community in which they operate. We extract them from other communities, centralize them in one particular area, and then just kind of eat them up and spit them out. They're disposable until we can find someone who will do the job cheaper in India or whatever, right? And so that's another huge aspect as well.
Yeah, you can see how this would be an insane breeding ground for resentment. People who've checked, not only from the hiring manager's perspective, they can hire based on checking the boxes and saying, I'm off the hook for the performance of this person. On the other side, on the actual job seeker side, they've checked every box. They've gone to college. They've acquired the skills, but they still can't get a job because who knows what, supply chain or COVID, doesn't matter. Inflation, they've checked the box. They deserve to be in a position that rewards them for their following the rule, for following the norms, for checking the boxes. And when that doesn't happen, you have an insane class of just a growing class of people, a strata of people who become deeply, deeply resentful, lonely, just total, sort of floating without any sense of meaning, existential direction. You see these crazy TikToks on Twitter of day in the life of, I don't know, the management consultant guy at Deloitte or a product manager at Facebook, and their lives are just so weirdly, just so crazy empty. And they check the box, they do this, they show up at work, but you can see they're just going through the motions. It's very, very bleak.
Yeah, and you see these, a lot of people love to give kind of the younger generations a hard time, like boomers and Gen X to some degree are like, oh well, you just get a job, just kind of put it together, get it together, whatnot. And at some level that's true, like that's good individual advice at the end of the day, because you're the only person that you have direct control over. But it's also very dismissive of a lot of systemic issues. Like these people did go to school, and they didn't go to school by paying it off with like a weekend job at Burger King like you did when you were going to school in the 1960s. Like these people have to get $100,000 in debt, so they can't like buy a home even if they manage to get a job when they come out of this stuff. And then like they get replaced by some guy from a foreign country a couple years later. They still have all this debt. They never built anything of value, because they never had the chance to pay off that student loan or whatever. And it's very unsurprising that so many of these people kind of end up bitter and just drop out of the economy, just drop out of competition, because if you're going to go through the system, if you're going to do everything the system demands of you, and then just get immediately replaced as soon as the system can find somebody who does what you do cheaper, why even bother to participate? What's the point? What's the point in conforming to the social norm? And so I think while it, kind of just clean up your room and suck it up is perhaps, unfortunately, the best personal advice you can kind of have, it's a terrible way for people to look at like the wider problem, because the wider problem is real, and it's going to continue to produce people with this level of resentment. Like there's just no way to avoid that if you're going to treat people this way.
Yeah. And so on this note, kind of what do you see as alternative, like people, what should, you have kids when they turn 18, what are you gonna encourage them to do? Go to college, like step into this rushing stream of credentialing and bureaucracy, or what will be your exhortation to your children?
It's going to be very difficult to know where people are going to go in the near future. I think that it's going to be a question of like how long these systems can sustain themselves. Again, a lot of this is really meta in a way that you can't individually control. So kind of on the wider level, we need people who are willing to put their money where their mouth is. We have a lot of conservatives that love to tell people, don't go to college. You don't need to go to college. We got to figure out some way to do something about this college thing. And then they own a business. And what's the first thing they slap on every job requirement? Oh, where's your college degree? Okay. Like what does that even mean? So if you are a conservative that owns a business, like do what you're saying, actually develop a system to develop talent, find different ways, find alternative certifications. I think the tech field is probably like the best version of this that exists right now. It's still far from perfect, but it's kind of the best thing where like, you don't have to have a specific college degree in something if you already have a specific tech certification, right? So if I have a constellation of certain abilities to like run certain softwares or mainframes or whatever, I'll get hired just because I've already proven my practical ability to do this. And whether or not I have a computer science degree or something really doesn't matter because I can prove my practical experience. That needs to be something that becomes a standard operating procedure kind of across these conservative businesses, where people can find ways to prove their the kind of their ability without having to do this directly. Now, this is a bit of a problem because, well, we have disparate impact law. And so, Griggs versus Duke Power means like there are certain tests, like IQ tests, that you're not allowed to use because they might have different disparate impacts on different groups of people. But like the certification is a good way to kind of show like it's just practical application of knowledge directly tied to the job. So it's not restricted by disparate impact law. So you can't just have like, you do have to get particular about how you do this, but there is a way that we can shape, this selection to not conform this. And by the way, if you're a conservative who wants to run a conservative business, this is beneficial for you because you're going to have to put like more effort in the beginning of finding people and investing in people, but you're much more likely to filter out like horrific liberals who will destroy your company because they'll be the ones with the college degrees, and the people who are less likely to have that stuff and will be applying through alternative means are the ones who are more likely to be aligned with your values.
Auron, I think you just gave the best pitch for our talent network, for the newfound
Sure.
talent.
Absolutely.
without realizing it. No, but that's basically what we're going to do, or what we're already doing, is creating an alternative credentialing system where you go back to how real trust-based communities work. You get a recommendation. Maybe you do have to have a set of skills to be a lawyer, to be a software engineer for sure, but again, back to our workforce analytics days, that's not the only thing that matters. Real business, especially dynamic ones, especially the ones that will see and lead the path forward from the managerial morass that we're in right now to whatever the next stage looks like, are going to be hiring based on entirely different credentialing structures and alternative hierarchy structures that don't conform to and that don't buy into these legacy sort of credentialing systems, and increasingly we hope to see more business owners hire based on these on the different structures, and also job seekers market themselves and look for companies that don't want to just flatten them into economic units to plug them into a slot. So, Auron, we're running to the end of our time here, but I wanted to ask you just a few last questions. These are rapid fire. First, on the book side, when is it coming out, and what's the timeline there? Where can people start to look for this?
Excellent question. I completed the last chapter, but I have to go back and rewrite the introduction because it was originally just a Substack, and so I've kind of retool it a bit. I've never written a book before, so I don't know what the manuscript turnaround time is, but I should be able to get the manuscript kind of to the publisher here in the next month or so, and then we'll kind of run them from there. So hopefully not too long, but I rest assured, as soon as I know, I will let everybody know.
Awesome. And then the questions we ask everybody on the podcast, and these are specific to your area of expertise, a lot of what the stuff we've talked about today. First is sort of the black pill question. What's worse than most people realize?
Ooh, I think what's worse than most people realize is to the extent at which we are reliant on managerial structures and how unstable they now are. I think a lot of people don't understand that, like, most of their life is fully dependent on these things, and once a critical mass of things go wrong under them, they kind of all go down simultaneously. So there's a real cascade effect that could occur if certain critical breaks in the system start showing up.
And on the other side, the white pill question, what's better than most people realize?
I think what's better than most people realize is that there is actually a good outcome to this. It's not guaranteed, but there is a good outcome. Most people look around at the world today and they're just terrified of change. They just say, oh, I just don't want things to change. But they're also looking at a community where, like, nobody can get a job and nobody can form a family. And, like, the central government is threatening to take away their kids if they don't want to teach them trans ideology. It's like, do you really not want things to change? Is that really what you want? Or it's actually, like, significant, meaningful change, pretty essential to the betterment of the lives of the people around you? And so I think that it's scary to have certain things end. No one, I think, would pick to be kind of at the end of the kind of the historical cycle, like the end of an epoch, but things have to end for there to be a new beginning. And I think we are in a position where, while there might be a very difficult time for us ahead, it means that our children and our grandchildren might be able to sit under the trees that we plant now. And so the good news is that there's an opportunity for you to make a very real difference in the future based on your willingness to invest in things that are going to outlast you. If you are willing to build those institutions, you are willing to build those communities, you're willing to build those relationships, the people after you might live much better, more meaningful lives because you were willing to put in the work now.
Amen. That's awesome. Great place to end. Auron, thanks again for coming on, making the time. Really enjoyed chatting with you, and we look forward to seeing the book when it comes out. Just quick notes, where can people follow you, read you, and find you?
Sure, absolutely. I've got the Total State Substack. Of course, all of my articles appear first on the Blaze, and my show's on Blaze TV. I'm also on Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, or MacIntyre Show on all your podcast platforms, all the places you'd expect.
Excellent. We'll link all that stuff in the show notes. Thanks again for coming on. Really enjoy this.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.